Liebe Studierende, liebe Freunde des Zentrums Altertumswissenschaften Zürich, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren. Es ist mir eine Freude, Sie heute zu einem letzten Abend im Rahmen unserer Ringvorlesung Naturkatastrophen, Epidemien, Plagen und was sie mit uns anrichten, begrüßen zu dürfen. Mein Name ist Andreas Viktor Walser und ich leite zusammen mit Christoph Riedwig das ZAZH. Mit dem heutigen Abend wollen wir nicht nur den Schlusspunkt zu unserer Ringvorlesung setzen, sondern in gewisser Hinsicht auch einen Kreis schließen, den wir am 23. Februar mit der Podiumsdiskussion mit Peter Maurer und Friederike Fless zu zeichnen begonnen haben, zugleich aber auch noch einmal die Perspektive ganz weit öffnen. Auch am heutigen Abend wollen wir noch einmal im Rahmen einer Podiumsdiskussion Aspekte unserer Thematik aufgreifen und mit Ihnen zusammen diskutieren. Bevor wir unsere Diskussion beginnen, darf ich das Wort an Klaus Jonas, den Dekan der Philosophischen Fakultät der Universität Zürich, übergeben. Er hat sich bereit erklärt, auch im Namen unserer Fakultät unsere beiden Podiumsteilnehmenden, Rupa Mukerji und Harper, zu begrüßen und selbstverständlich auch Sie herzlich willkommen zu heißen.
Ja, zur Abschlussdiskussion dieser Lecture-Serie steuere ich als Dekan der Philosophischen Fakultät gerne ein Grußwort bei. Das ZAZH ist in meiner Wahrnehmung als Dekan aktuell eines der erfolgreichsten Kompetenzzentren unserer Fakultät. Dabei meine ich die erstaunlich hohe Kadenz der Durchführung von interessanten Ringvorlesungen, die Durchführung von Tagungen, Einladungen von GastprofessorInnen, die Einrichtung einer Gast-Junior-Professur, die Durchführung von Sommerkursen für SchülerInnen, die Aktivitäten im Bereich der Kinderuniversität, die Präsenz in den Medien, die Verwendung moderner sozialer Medien, die Online-Speicherung von Ringvorlesungen anstelle der traditionellen Speicherung in Form von gedruckten Tagungsbänden, die Gründung des Sokrates-Clubs, die erfolgreiche Einwerbung von Fundraising und anderes mehr. Besonders hervorzuheben ist dabei auch der Erfolg des ZAZH bei der interdisziplinären und interfakultären Zusammenarbeit. Dieser kreative Blumenstrauß von Aktivitäten und die dabei erreichte Qualität der Veranstaltungen sind relativ einmalig. Das ist jetzt keine Übertreibung von mir, sondern ich habe ja an einigen der genannten Veranstaltungen des ZAZH teilgenommen und sie sehr genossen. Zudem läuft derzeit in unserer Fakultät gerade eine Evaluation einiger Kompetenzzentren unserer Fakultät, darunter eben auch das ZAZH, und es zeichnet sich bereits jetzt eine erfolgreiche Bewertung des ZAZH ab. Bei den bisherigen und künftigen Veranstaltungen des ZAZH gibt es ein klar erkennbares Leitprinzip. Die Antike, ihre Erfahrungen und die Denkanstöße, die sie enthält, sollen für die Gegenwart lebendig gemacht werden, indem Themen wie Migration und Kulturkontakt, Demokratie und Populismus, antike Wurzeln europäischer Identität und eben das Thema Naturkatastrophen und Epidemien behandelt werden. Die Vorträge und Diskussionen zielen jeweils darauf ab, einerseits die Antike in diesen Themenausschnitten wieder lebendig zu machen und andererseits zu zeigen, dass es anthropologische, das heißt soziale, politische, psychologische Konstanten in der Menschheitsgeschichte gibt. Demnach sind beispielsweise Vorbehalte und Ängste gegenüber Migranten heute im Vergleich zu den Migrationsbewegungen in der Antike von den Kernprozessen her gesehen sehr ähnlich. Oder wenn man das Phänomen des Populismus und der Demagogie betrachtet, erkennt man die Gemeinsamkeiten in den Argumentationsfiguren eines Trump und antiker Populisten. Auch wenn wir heute medizinisch um Welten besser aufgestellt sind, um der Corona-Pandemie zu begegnen, als es die Antike war, gibt es trotzdem auch Parallelen zwischen der Wucht, mit der die Welt der Gegenwart von der aktuellen Pandemie getroffen wurde, und der Art, wie Epidemien in der Antike gewirkt haben. Es ist auch beispielsweise spannend, die damaligen mit den heutigen Deutungsmustern solcher Katastrophen zu vergleichen. Ich hoffe, dass deutlich geworden ist, welche Wertschätzung das ZAZH und seine Veranstaltungen im Fakultätsvorstand der Philosophischen Fakultät genießen. Und aus meiner Sicht braucht auch gar nicht weiter betont zu werden, dass diese Wertschätzung natürlich auch von der Universitätsleitung und in der Wahrnehmung durch die Öffentlichkeit geteilt wird. Damit möchte ich schließen und wünsche uns allen eine interessante Abschlussveranstaltung dieser interdisziplinären Ringvorlesung des Frühjahrssemesters 2021.
Ja, lieber Klaus, ganz herzlichen Dank für diese einführenden Worte. The lecture series that closes today, and with this I will move to English, gave us the opportunity to look at a wide variety of natural disasters, epidemics, and plagues, both in the ancient and in our contemporary world. Specialists from many different fields presented their insights and critical reflections, leading us from the rather distant past in the ancient Near East to our contemporary world. From the beginning, the aim of this lecture series was to conduct a dialogue between the ancient world and our present world. The way in which we look at the past is always shaped by our experiences of the present. At the same time, the way in which we experience the present is necessarily shaped by our experiences of the past, not only the experiences that we have made in our own lives, but experiences from the near and distant past. These experiences are inscribed both in our human nature and in our culture. As Frank Rühli has shown in his presentation, we carry a heavy backpack, as he styled it, when we are confronted with natural catastrophes and disasters today. This backpack was slowly filled over time from the beginnings of human history with behavioral strategies that help us to cope with our daily lives in so-called normal times, as well as in exceptional periods in states of emergency. Not all the tools that we find in our backpack work all the time. Some that are necessary in one situation become harmful in others. Some coping strategies have to be unlearned. Humans, these excessively social animals, have to learn that, at least in some cases, keeping social distance might be the best strategy to survive. In the focus of this lecture series have not been the natural disasters and catastrophes in and by themselves as natural events, but the various ways in which human societies in various periods in history and places dealt with them. And they have to be dealt with on different levels. One, and the most pressing, is simple survival. Fires have to be extinguished. The ashes of the volcano has to be escaped. Diseases must be contained. The people must be fed from a barren country. This fight for survival is not only one fought by individuals, but by a society as a whole. We have seen how states reacted to these kinds of crises. The emperor in ancient Rome or Constantinople, or different regimes in developing countries in the global south today. Survival is obviously not enough. It always implies to look into the future. What can be done so that this never happens again? What can be done so that Rome will not burn again to the ground? How can we stop the next wave of the epidemic? What kind of catastrophes do we have to expect in the future, and what disaster do we have to accept as unavoidable consequences of the way we are living? Do we continue to live on the fertile soil of the volcano as if we would not know that it might explode again? But as we have seen, coping with catastrophes implies more than just immediate survival. It also means coping with the psychological consequences of the disasters. Disasters disrupt our understandings of the world. They confront us with the unthinkable. Things happen that we never thought that they could happen, or at least not to us. They confront us with difficult questions. Why does this happen? How could this happen? Who is to blame? In this lecture series, we followed the quest for answers to these questions from the ancient Near East, Egypt, India, archaic Greece, Rome, Byzantium, and medieval Florence to Hollywood. We have wondered about eccentric strategies like appeasing an angry god with beer, but we also have wondered about recurring images that try to make the unimaginable manifest. The dialogue between the past and the present in our lecture series has mostly been implicit through the juxtaposition of different periods in different lectures. Today, we want to make the dialogue explicit in the most direct form in a panel discussion that tries to relate past and present. Today, we move to a topic and to focus that is one of the greatest challenges of our contemporary world, climate change. And with this, I come to the presentation of our panelists today. And it is my great honor to introduce to you Rupa Mukerji and Karl Harper. Rupa Mukerji, who can join us here in the lecture room, represents the contemporary part of our panel. She heads the Advisory Services Department of Helvetas, the Swiss development organization probably known to many of you. Helvetas supports poor and disadvantaged people in more than 30 developing and transition countries. Rupa is also a member of Helvetas Management Board. Trained both in natural sciences, in zoology, and in management, Rupa Mukerji looks back on work experiences in diverse institutions from the private sector to many NGOs on 4 different continents. She's a development professional with expertise in adaptation to climate change, sustainable development, and policy analysis. Rupa Mukerji contributes to the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the United Nations body for assessing the science related to climate change, and is a lead author of its 5th and 6th assessment reports. She also contributes to Swiss and global media through articles and commentaries, most recently in the context of our referendum on the CO2 law. Dr. Karl Harper, who joins us through Zoom, is Professor of Classics and Letters at the University of Oklahoma. Karl Harper studied at the University of Oklahoma and at Harvard. He is a historian of the ancient world, and his wide-ranging and productive work spanned economic, environmental, and social history. His first book, published in 2011, discussed slavery in the late Roman world. His next book, published only 2 years later with the title From Shame to Sin, analyzed the Christian transformation of sexual morality. As interesting as both these books are, it is the most recent one that motivated us to invite him today to this panel. In The Fate of Rome, Climate, Disease, and the End of an Empire, Karl Harper combined recent scientific insights into the ecological history of the ancient Mediterranean with the history of the Roman Empire to provide new and original, and therefore also controversial, explanations for the rise and fall of the Roman Empire and the transformation of the late Roman world. We will start our discussion with an opening statement both by Kyle and Rupa, followed by a discussion between our panelists. For the second part, we will take up questions from you. As usual, you can use the chat to ask your questions, either in English or, if necessary, in German, and Christoph Riedwig will bring them into the discussion. I will now give the word to Kyle for his opening statement.
Wonderful. Victor, could you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? Perfect. Great. Well, Victor, thank you for organizing this and inviting me. I'm honored to be here and to have this wonderful chance for a conversation with you and with Rupa, which I think is a fascinating way to approach some of these urgent questions, both for our own world, but also for those of us who are interested in ancient societies. I want to briefly spend this overview trying to put into perspective what we know about the history of ancient climate and climate change and how that's developed over the last few years, why it's important, what are some of the questions that have been asked and that we might ask going forward. And environmental history, broadly, the study of the relationship between humans and the environment, is a mature subfield within the discipline of history that has been the site of tremendously creative research for 2 or 3 generations now. But those of us who work on the history of environments today, I think, are very fortunate to work at a time when the amount of evidence, the kind of archives that we have to explore the history of things like the climate system have grown and continue to grow exponentially. And to me, over the last 10 or 15 years, that's been a source of extraordinary excitement and opportunity for historians to work with partners, collaborate with scholars in a variety of disciplines and fields. And I think it's worth underscoring that the concern over modern climate change, over human-driven rapid climate change, is really the motivation behind the gathering and accumulation of new kinds of data sets. In other words, paleoclimatology is in many ways a side effect of our urgent need to understand and model the climate, to understand how it works and what's likely to happen as humans continue to impact the environment. So the funding and urgency to understand the history of the climate provides historians, people who are interested in the past, both for its own sake, but also because it helps us understand our own world. We're sort of the unintended beneficiaries of this great burst of knowledge. And there's now several decades of really a rich and growing proxy record. So obviously, for contemporary times, we have tremendously accurate instrumental data about climate parameters like temperature, precipitation, and so on. But as we go back even more than a century or so, the instrumental record starts to disappear. There's still human observations, but these become less rich and less scientific the further back in the past we go. So to really know what the climate was like in the deeper past, like the Roman past, requires using proxy records. So indications of different climate variables that can be gained from records like ice cores, tree rings, marine, other kinds of sediments that in one way or another allow scientists to reconstruct a record of what was happening in the past. So over the last, particularly 20 years or so, the number, the regional variety, as well as the accuracy of different kinds of climate records has exploded. And it's really helped us understand the big picture of climate change in the Holocene. The Holocene is the epoch of climate history in which we live. It's the last 12,000 years or so. And it's sort of the backdrop for human history as we know it. And certainly for ancient, medieval, and modern civilizations, the Holocene climate, which is relatively warm and relatively stable in the even deeper picture of deep climate history, and is a kind of friendly environment for building human civilizations. That is, there's still climate variability and climate change within the Holocene, but the magnitude of climate change within this last nearly 12,000 year period is smaller relative to what had come before, which is a period of massive climate changes, repeated ice ages, and then periods of warmer temperature that were much larger swings of climate change. So we live within the Holocene. The entirety of Roman history takes place against the backdrop of the Holocene. But the Holocene is still, we've come to appreciate, a period that is a time of climate variability and climate change driven by purely natural factors. So we're used to thinking about modern contemporary climate change in terms of human-driven or anthropogenic factors, namely greenhouse gas emissions that trap heat But when we're thinking about climate change in the deeper past, it's natural climate change that's driven by changes in the orbital dynamics, changes in the way that the sun rotates or travels around the Earth, tiny changes that alter the amount and distribution of solar energy. And then particularly on shorter time scales, volcanic eruptions that can have really significant human impacts at a human scale. So the climate over the Holocene period changes. And of course, this has been known from various records in a very crude way for a long time. Probably familiar with the Little Ice Age, the period of climate history centered on the 17th century that was exceptionally cold in much of the Northern Hemisphere. So the knowledge that there's climate variability and climate change in the Holocene isn't entirely new, but as we've acquired new data sets, more precise and richer climate archives, it's really helped us sketch the big picture. And for those of us interested in classical antiquity, we have a now much clearer picture of really the larger dynamics of what was happening in the background. And for those of us who are interested in, say, the Roman Empire, it's an exciting time to be able to draw from some of these new sources of knowledge. The Roman Empire is an extraordinary ecological and geographical political entity that, depending on how you calculate, endures for nearly half a millennium. It encompasses a huge range of different ecological systems that at its core is centered on a Mediterranean region where really intense seasonal differences between the summer and the winter that drive major changes in temperature and precipitation are really the heart of a constantly demanding and in some ways constantly changing environment. But the Roman Empire also encompasses semi-arid and arid territories along its southern and eastern rim, continental and oceanic climates in of course, Central Europe and Western and Northwestern Europe. So the Roman Empire is a massive territory that encompasses a huge range of different ecological systems in which humans are always adapted to experience patterns of climate challenge. What we now know is that the period of the Roman Empire, from the beginning of the Common Era through the 5th or 6th century, is a period with important different phases of climate history. So at the beginning of this period, what even the climate scientists called the Roman climate optimum was a broadly warm and stable period that gives way by the end of this period, the very end of the Roman Empire in the 6th and 7th centuries, to what is now being proposed to be called the late antique Little Ice Age, a period that was much more variable and certainly much cooler. So I think this gives us a chance to tell stories of change, of challenge, of adaptation, to trace both short-term climate challenges like drought and flood that cause harvest failures and induce immediate climate crises, to even longer-term changes that affect the habitability of arid regions and the agricultural productivity of core regions of the Mediterranean. And then to explore the higher order human impacts of agricultural production, migration, violence, and demography. One of the dimensions that I think is particularly important, and I hope we'll have a chance to talk about, are the really complicated but profoundly important relationships between infectious disease and climate change. I think this is one of the areas where we're likely to learn a lot in the coming decade, is the really important links, multifaceted links between the climate system and systems of human health. The climate can affect human health by affecting agricultural productivity. So for instance, we know that food shortage caused by famine, caused by drought, can weaken the human population and render it vulnerable to epidemic disease. We also know that climate can affect the vectors of disease, whether insect vectors like mosquitoes or mammal reservoirs of disease like rodents and plague. And climate change can also drive human migrations that have tremendous consequences for human health. And one of the, I think, really profound lessons to be drawn from the Roman experience is that it's the concatenation of disasters, both climatological and epidemiological. In other words, it's the stress of climate change in the short term, along with the impact of epidemic disease that over and over again pose the most severe challenges to certainly ancient societies. In the case of both the 2nd century Antonine plague and the 6th century Justinianic plague, caused by very different biological agents, it's nonetheless the combination of climate stress and health stress that proves very difficult for even relatively resilient ancient societies to overcome. There are obviously profound differences between the ancient world and our own. The Roman society is built on an agrarian economy where most people live directly on the land, and the economy is dependent on annual agricultural output. Climate change is caused by natural factors rather than human factors. And it's a world where travel, communication, and interdependence is limited by the lack of fossil fuels and fossil fuel-driven transport. The ancient societies that we study are resilient, but still interconnected. Our own world, of course, is one that is still dependent on agrarian production, that is still vulnerable, and in some ways is more resilient, but also more fragile because it is more interconnected. And our societies are dependent upon one another and exposed to the crises that are always relatively difficult to localize and ultimately come back to impact us all, as the COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us. Ultimately, maybe the most important lesson, as Victor was so beautifully saying in his overview, is that the human-environmental relation is really fundamental to the destiny of societies. And the way we understand the classical antiquity is likely to influence the way we understand ourselves and confront the challenges that we face.
Thank you very much, Kyle, for this beautiful overview. I now give the word to Rupa for her opening statement.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walser. Thank you very much to the University of Zurich for inviting me and for coming to know about your work. Dr. Kyle Harper, I really enjoyed the last book, and I'm looking forward to more. So it's been a great opportunity for me to be here today. And I look forward to talk to you about climate change and the future. So I think it's a nice way to round off these weeks of conversations that you've had. I would like to focus on the aspect of climate change and the future with a specific focus on anthropogenic climate change, that is human-induced changes in the natural system. And it is important to talk about that because this is still within human capacity to address and mitigate. One of the challenging aspects of communicating climate change that we experienced as part of the UN IPCC that Victor referred to, I've been a part of it for the past 10 years, was that the decision-making time horizons for various policymakers, businesses, etc., do not match the time horizons of our climate models, which are talking about and projecting the future climate to 2100, and in most democratic societies, the election cycles determine the decision-making time horizons of policymakers. So this mismatch in communicating the urgency of climate change and communicating the urgency of need to act upon it has been one of the key challenges of the IPCC process. And one of the narratives that evolved in 2010, when I first started working with the IPCC, was that a child born today in a developed country is most likely to be still alive in 2100. So think of the climate outcome for that child. And now 10 years down the line, this is almost a certainty for any child that is born in Switzerland today. Another aspect that brings the impacts of anthropogenic climate change closer to humans is the experience of climate extremes. Multiple simultaneous extreme events impacting globally connected systems, such as the food crisis that we experienced in 2008, where food production systems in two major production areas of Russia and Australia had a cascading impact on global food prices, made us aware of how interconnected, how interdependent we are, and how the cascading impacts can flow through both shortages of food, but also knee-jerk policy responses which affect the whole system. And such kind of crises have followed in 2010, 2015, and we have seen the failure of multiple interconnected systems, playing out in real times. For some of us involved in assessment of the literature, it has been sometimes a realization that things are happening sooner than they were projected. So something we anticipated might happen by 2030 or so is actually playing out right now. And my colleague Michael Oppenheimer, who's also a lead author of the IPCC, recently said, climate skeptics and deniers have often accused scientists of exaggerating the threats of climate change. But the evidence shows that not only have they not exaggerated, in several cases they've also underestimated. And this holds true for the recent special report on the impact of climate change on the oceans, which goes way beyond previous IPCC sea level rise projections and puts at risk investments and lives along the seacoast in most continents of the world. The impacts that we experience of extreme events are a combination of increased exposure, existing vulnerabilities, and the changing nature of hazards themselves. 83% of the disasters in the last 10 years, for example, were triggered by extreme weather and climate-related events. There's a growing trend towards this since the 1960s. There's been a 35% increase since 1990. And over 400,000 people have been killed by these extreme events, mainly in developing countries. So the losses to assets are in developed countries, but the loss of lives is predominantly in developing countries. We are only now understanding the impact of extreme heat, for example, on people in the African continent. There's a lot of information, research about that in Europe, but the impacts of extreme heat are still an area of study in developing countries. Also, one of the main reasons for mortality are storms. The causality with conflicts and migration, although much talked about, is quite quickly established, and there is weak evidence regarding this. We also see collaboration, changes in social relations, improved management, and technological advances, which are in response to resource scarcity and pressures. The interface between climate change and biodiversity is an important one. The IPCC has been repeatedly highlighting this as a key risk, but it did not receive its due policy attention. But of course, COVID-19 changes all that, and now the IPCC and its sister organization, the IPBES, work much more closely together, and I think this portends well for the future. What happens when these intersect? For example, in the course of this pandemic, we have had about 100 extreme events just in the first 6 months of this pandemic. This is something that Kyle talked about. India itself was battered by 2 massive cyclones in the last year, and the third one is on its way. It will hit the land tomorrow. So the lack of resilience of various systems is radically exposed when these events combine. In the last cyclone that hit western part of India, at least 155 people died. And this is because the entire system of government was completely consumed with addressing the impacts of the pandemic. Another aspect that I wanted to touch upon was the process of urbanization. This was a hallmark of the Roman Empire, and many of the lessons are valid today. By 2050, it is estimated that 570 low-lying coastal cities will face projected sea level rise of at least 0.5 meter. This puts over 800 million people at risk from the impacts of rising sea and storm surges. The global economic cost to cities from rising seas and flooding could amount to $1 trillion by mid-century. These figures do not sound so shocking anymore now that we have experienced the financial impacts of the pandemic, but they're substantial and in several cases preventable. Local factors mean that cities will experience sea level rise at different paces. So cities on the east coast of the United States, along with major cities in Asia, are particularly vulnerable. So while property losses in Miami or New York will be very high, in the range of, I think, $2 to $3.5 trillion because of the very expensive property along the coasts. It's Kolkata, Mumbai, and Dhaka that have the highest number of people at risk from coastal inundation. And the numbers are staggering. Between 11 to 14 million people will be at risk of flooding because they're living along the coast in these mega cities. I would like to close with some examples of what climate change means for some of the mega cities of today, and these are not New York, Rome, or Venice, but rather Dar es Salaam, which is the largest city in Tanzania. It is estimated that 8% of the city already lies below sea level, which puts about 143,000 people at risk from coastal inundation. But the city is also experiencing very rapid population growth at the rate of about 5.3% per year, a lot of it driven by migration from smaller cities or villages. And it means that unplanned informal settlements are expanding into the floodplains. Here, the poor residents are highly susceptible to the impacts of climate change. The vulnerability is heightened by inadequate stormwater drainage, inadequate sewage, piping services, which result in severe public health hazards during floods. Another megacity at risk from anthropogenic climate change is Jakarta. It has been experiencing regular flooding in the past. So in 1976, they had a major flood. But in recent times, the frequency of floods has increased. So every 5 or 6 years, they have a major flood now. So major floods in 1990, then 96, then 2002, 2007, and 2012. In northern Jakarta, close to 90% of the metropolitan region already lies below sea level, and more than 60% of the city's 10.6 million residents, particularly the poor, live in informal and high-density settlements, and they're vulnerable to flooding. It's also especially susceptible to sea level rise and high tides, since it's experiencing one of the fastest land subsidence rates in the world. There are plenty of illegal wells dug for water, which is deflating the city from below, while the crushing weight of urban sprawl adds additional pressure, causing land to sink by 20 to 25 centimeters a year, especially in certain areas of North Jakarta. Another city that I'm quite familiar with is Mumbai, which faces similar challenges. In the summer season, it has a tiny little river that nobody pays much attention to. It's been massively encroached upon. But when it rains in the monsoon season, upstream, the river becomes a roaring, raging river. And if it happens at high tide, then the water has no outlet to escape, and most of the city gets flooded. So the city, which is the financial capital of India, housing about 20 million people, comes to a complete standstill. The airport is closed, the transport infrastructure stops, the electricity has to be switched off because of fears of electrocution. So a tiny little river can bring the whole city to its knees. Due to their financial capacity, larger cities have the capacity to act on risk reduction. We see the mayors taking action. There are coalitions of mayors that have come about, a little bit the rise of the city-states. They also have the political weight to define their own priorities. We see stark differences also in the response to COVID, for example, in India, between the city of Mumbai and other cities. Mumbai contributes about 40% of the direct taxes to the government in India. And I think governance, which is a key determinant for preparedness, will completely determine the response of cities to these pandemics. We will have some very important lessons to learn from the local governance systems with regard to preparedness, accountability, and response capacity. So from a historical perspective and from all the work of Kyle and academics like that, we have seen that we have been at these inflection points before. We have rich understanding of how they've played out. Respecting nature and observing and adapting to the natural environment has been the key to survival. A disconnect has always brought down empires in the past, and it portends to do so also for governments in the present. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rupa, for this rich opening statement. I would like to just take up a few points from both of your statements. You've shown us, Rupa, the already dramatic consequences that we see today of climate change, and therefore the question is, of course, what are the adaptation strategies, especially in the global south? We are now in the situation that the developing countries who had the least impact on anthropogenic climate change are now the first who are asked to adapt. How can they adapt in a sustainable manner, adapting to climate change while still driving their development forward?
Thanks, that's a very good question, and that's at the crux of all the work that we do. Not an easy question to answer, because adaptation is something that is very context-specific. So what works in a particular context may be maladaptive in another. For example, resorting to protective irrigation might work in a certain area where you have adequate water resources, but entrenching reliance on irrigation might actually delay another kind of adaptation in a region that is likely to face water stress. So we are now, for the last 30 years or so, there's been plenty of work on documenting different adaptation pathways, assessing the conditions for their success. Now we are engaged in really looking at feasibility of adaptation options, and the key challenge is how do you combine adaptation with a basic level of development. So the people who are facing the impacts of climate change have severe energy poverty, they have inadequate and access to nutritious food, they have inadequate avenues for economic diversification, and one must address all these developmental challenges while also ensuring that these don't take us on a high emission pathway, are ecologically sustainable, and are helping people to cope with the stresses that they are facing now. So we talk about climate resilient development pathways, which are basically ways in which we can combine or we can address the multiple objectives of achieving the development goals encapsulated in the Agenda 2030, while also protecting people from the most drastic impacts of climate change and not choosing options that are high emission. I think we talk about four important transitions. The most important one would be in energy, and here technical options have become available. With the feasibility of renewable energy, the dramatic reduction in cost of renewable energy, which makes leapfrogging possible. People don't have to follow the same pathway of grid-based, coal-fired, or natural gas-based energy systems, but we could have decentralized solar or wind-powered systems catering to communities that are disconnected from the grid at the moment. Similarly, there are localized ways of handling water resources better, because one of the most important transmitters of the climate stress is through water. So areas that have too much rain will experience more heavy rains, more erratic rainfall, so capacities of storage structures need to be adapted. Areas that are drier will go further dry, and their livelihoods have to adapt. So multiple transitions have to be done. One of the most important one, which connects the north and the south, is the transformation of our food system. We have very high wastage of food, which is an easy one to address, 30% in developing countries between the farm and the market, and 30% in developed countries between the market and the table is wasted. So that's a quick win, but easier said than done. Also on the production system, so more agroecological practices, etc. But the most important transformation that has to happen, and we all realize that, is the transformation in mindsets, to recognize the problem and to make commitments beyond what is legally binding, and for the civil society to ensure that governments stand by these commitments and actually move towards raising ambitions, which is the goal of the Paris Agreement. Thanks.
When we look at adaptation strategies from a historical perspective, when you look at the Roman Empire or the end of the Roman Empire, can we identify adaptation strategies that were more successful than others? Have there been exceptional examples of societies, of parts of the Roman Empire that were more successful than others to adapt to the challenges they were confronted with, Kyle?
Thanks. That's a big question and a hard one. I loved what Rupa was just saying about sort of the adaptation, but also its limits. And we certainly can, I think, usefully have that model in mind when we think about what, as she put it, the kind of trade-offs of, say, irrigation dependence. And I think we don't obviously have as much knowledge as we would like about the nature of adaptation in the Roman and later Roman world. A lot of it has to be inferred from archaeological remains, but we know that Roman peasants were profoundly in touch with the physical environment and the agrarian ecology of the worlds that they lived in, and responded to challenges through things like irrigation. And so much of the Mediterranean's already semi-arid, and in some ways we can think of the irrigation technologies of the ancient world as a form of adaptation to challenge, and at the same time it also creates a new kind of vulnerability. And there's always a threshold beyond which human societies cannot very likely overcome challenges. And let me give one example, just some recent archaeological work, even since the time that I published my last book in 2017. There's really extraordinary archaeological work happening in the Negev highlands, which was a thriving region in late antiquity. And it was really an extraordinary place that was, of course, famous. If you're a late Roman scholar, you know that it was famous for wine, and much the way today you might think of Bordeaux or Burgundy as sort of synonymous with great wine. Gaza was famous for its exports, not what you think of Gaza for today, but in the late Roman period it was. And the archaeological traces of this that Israeli teams have been excavating are really extraordinary, and very much an example of adaptation to a semi-arid environment, perhaps less arid than it is today, but still required tremendous human ingenuity and deep understanding of the local environment. And ultimately, though, this system of production comes to an end in the later 6th century, and not totally understood why. It could be climate driven. That's one reasonable hypothesis, although we don't actually have very good local climate proxies for the Southeast Mediterranean that would at present let us really follow that story in detail. It could also be plague, which we know in the 6th century becomes a major demographic factor It could be still other things. In my view, it's probably all of these. It's probably the concatenation of changes in precipitation, simultaneous with changes in health that overwhelm a system that had worked perfectly for the century and a half before, but was vulnerable because it depended on fairly intricate systems, technological and human, for the control of rainwater to allow agriculture. So I think we can use archaeological evidence with these kind of modern examples in mind to try and understand how did ancient societies respond. I do think that most of the ancient responses are going to be more grassroots. So this is a world where talk about the capacity of governance at the sort of regional and super regional levels, fairly limited. The central imperial state isn't implementing energy and environmental and agricultural policies that really are shaping human resilience on the ground. Rather, responses are very local, highly diverse, in some cases probably more effective than others. And the example from the Negev is probably an example where there's relatively little policy intervention from a central state, but rather local response and management of the environmental challenges. I think you can see that in the response to the infectious disease challenges of the Roman world, where there's relatively little developed response from the central state, but rather at the city and even more local level, people are adapting, sometimes probably very, very ineffectively, but other times probably relatively meaningfully. And so just to give an example on that side, it's relatively little appreciated, but the first examples that are documented of what we would call quarantine, they don't call it that, but biosecurity interventions to disrupt the transmission of pathogens, even though they don't understand the microbiology of what causes infectious disease. They realize that you can do things to disrupt the transmission of disease. And farmers know that. We have ancient texts that talk about the importance of controlling the transmission of disease when herds start to get sick. And the same logic probably governs local responses when there are known to be epidemics that are spreading. It's as early as the 7th century that we have example of local authorities trying to implement what we would call quarantine to disrupt the transmission of pathogens. So in other words, the ancient examples are probably going to be local. They're going to be hard to trace in the written record, although not impossible, but probably were highly diverse in their outcomes.
I think that's probably an important question for you too. On what level have the reactions to happen to these different challenges? I think there are, of course, things like climate change that have to be addressed on a worldwide level, but still also on the local level. And then the importance of the reaction, adaptation strategies to the specific situations on a local level. You mentioned the importance of governance structures. We've also seen that in a lecture. Can you say something on that, maybe?
Yeah, the responses do need to be at multiple levels. So the Paris Agreement is a global legally binding agreement among nations to restrict global warming to less than 2 levels, 2 degrees centigrade, ideally 1.5. And countries are bound to now contribute to this global goal, global temperature goal, through emission reductions through instruments called the Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs. Now, countries are in the process of doing this, but the real challenge in developing countries is to what extent are these NDCs owned by people in the country. So the NDCs make a lot of commitment about afforestation, reforestation, transformation of land in various ways. And in contexts that are challenged by weak governance, poor participation of people in decision-making, one of the important concerns is this disconnect between contribution to a globally set target and what has been discussed and owned and understood by people at different levels. Another thing that we don't talk about too much is that all the climate models that take us to 1.5 degree global warming have a very important component of bioenergy and carbon capture and storage. And this requires transformation of land on a massive scale never seen in human history, converting land to forests, converting them to carbon sinks, and there are also high-end technologies to capture CO2 from the atmosphere. Switzerland is host to one such. And it is at an enormous cost. But these are the assumptions that underlie models. And one of the unintended consequences of the popularity of models is that people do not understand fully what lies behind and believe that there's a pathway to achieving this. And if these are not discussed, then there could be another generation of land alienation, non-involvement of communities in decisions that are fundamental to their livelihoods. So this is one of the important governance challenges devolving from the global agreement to what's happening at the local level. Adaptation responses need to be at multiple levels. So certain decisions have to be taken by national governments, for example, on topics such as how to manage water resources, given that glaciers are melting. So there would be a moment of peak water when they release much of their water resources. When does that come? Is your infrastructure ready for that? And thereafter, there will be a reduction in water availability. So are your systems ready for that? So this is something that has to be done at the national level, often at an international level, because most of the important rivers are also transboundary, right? Then there are certain things that need to be decided at a more local level, such as agricultural decisions, investing in adequate crop agricultural research, which is a process that takes 20 to 30 years. Many countries are not doing this, testing varieties, deriving varieties from the wild species, deriving genomes from wild species that are better adapted to drier or warmer conditions. And this kind of research is not dispersed across countries. Many do not realize the importance of this. A centralized system of plant research and development of seed varieties, etc., will reach its limits because the context is changing at the local level quite rapidly. So local level seed systems, having systems to maintain local agrobiodiversity, these become very important, and these are things that happen at the local level. Many a times the seasonal weather that people are experiencing for their agriculture is beyond their past experience. So traditional knowledge also reaches its limits, and it needs to be fertilized by scientific know-how from outside, and a new system of knowledge needs to be created. So this is an interface across various levels. So actions are needed at multiple levels, and I think good governance is fundamental to ensure that the stakeholders are themselves involved, and we don't fall into a regime of top-down policies that disempower the poorest, who are actually the most vulnerable. I think this is the biggest governance concern.
Thank you. I would like to open up the discussion now and give Christoph Riedweg a word for the first question.
We have actually already quite a considerable number of questions, and the first question is directed to Professor Harper. To what extent did the ancients have a conception of climate change, especially as a catalyst of societal decline or destruction? And of course, everybody is also thanking you very much, both of you, for your wonderful talks.
Thank you, and it's a great question, and I think that the basic answer is that they did not have a conception of climate change that we would recognize. And so we're approaching these societies and asking them to help us understand questions that they did not perceive in anything like the categories that we have. And I think that's okay. It's a challenge conceptually for us, but it's important nonetheless that we try to get at these issues. And I think there's a very exact parallel in the history of infectious disease, because by and large, these are societies, the societies of the classical Mediterranean, that didn't have germ theory, with a few fairly marginal exceptions that are intriguing. The dominant paradigms in both Greek and Roman culture don't allow for invasive microbiological agents. So they didn't understand infectious disease, but they were still, it would be hard to overstate the fundamental importance of infectious disease, even in a normal time, much less during times of health crisis. And so whether it's climate or disease, we're talking in categories that they didn't have. They perceived the climate as a kind of implicitly normal, relatively stable part of the background. They were aware, at least certainly by the time of the late Roman Republic, of the importance of climatological differences across the entire empire. They're aware of the really fundamental differences of flora and fauna. They perceive short-term climate change, and certainly perceive it sometimes in religious terms, of course. Do not understand the mechanisms of what causes it. There's a well-known climate event in the 6th century in the year 536. The sun disappears for about a year and a half. This is well attested in human records. So they perceive short-term anomalies, but they, of course, can't explain why it happened. We now very strongly believe that it was volcanic. The mechanism that caused the sun to dim for an extended period was the emission of huge amounts of sulfur into the atmosphere that aerosolized and blocked the absorption of solar radiation. So we can provide a naturalistic explanation, but none of the ancient sources perceive it in those terms. So we have to try and understand the way that they think about events like that, whether it's disease or the climate. They do every now and then seem to have observations of longer term changes. So for instance, Pliny the Elder in his encyclopedia will sometimes make observations about flora and fauna that we can sort of read as an awareness of longer term changes, but that's relatively exceptional rather than sort of incorporated into the mainstream way of thinking about the natural world.
We have a second question, which is also addressed to Professor Harper, but I think in the second part also regards Rupa. But it's very interesting to look at climate change from a historical perspective. You mentioned the Justinian plague. How big a factor was climate change in Roman times? And follow-up question, which probably really regards rather you, how much of the current pandemic is due to global warming, climate change? Kai.
I'll start with that, but would love to hear Rupa's thoughts as well. And it really seemed like there were kind of two questions there at the beginning, one about the Justinian plague and then one about climate change more broadly. And I could go on about both of those topics, but I'll try to be concise here and start with the Justinian plague piece of the question, which is a very intriguing one to me, and one where we know we ought to be thinking about it, but we don't have answers yet. And I just mentioned the solar dimming event of 536, which we now believe from both ice cores and tree rings is very likely a northern hemispheric volcanic event that's then followed approximately 5 years later by a very significant tropical volcanic event that in turn, these two events sort of back-to-back major volcanic eruptions induce a period of abrupt climate change. By some indications, the tree ring records of the Northern Hemisphere suggests that this is one of the most extreme decadal scale cooling episodes of the later Holocene. So over the last 2,000 to 3,000 years, this is one of the really, really severe moments where societies are suddenly confronted with really rapid cooling. And we're told of harvest failures and famine and starvation that follow on that. Almost simultaneously, in the year 541, the bubonic plague breaks out on the shores of the southern Mediterranean. According to our most important contemporary historian, Procopius, it first appeared at Pelusium, which is on the Mediterranean, but closely, it's right across from the Gulf of Suez, connected to the Red Sea. This is the beginning of the plague of Justinian, which is very likely the most significant biological event in all of Roman history. It's very well attested in the contemporary sources and increasingly documented by ancient DNA work that is caused by the bacterium that causes the plague. It's the bacterium Yersinia pestis. And is it really, so is whatever we think of it, it's a major biological event that happens almost simultaneously with this also major climate event. The problem is we have a flash and a bang. And so we intuitively think they probably are connected. We don't really know how. We don't know if it's that human societies become more susceptible to infection, to morbidity and mortality because of the harvest failures. That may explain some of it. I don't think it's totally convincing. It could be that the sort of global scale climate crisis causes human movements, migrations that affect the ecology of plague. That's a possibility, but it's speculative. It could be that the sudden climate changes affect other species like rodents or fleas. The plague is a very ecologically complex disease that involves a range of different species. It's really a rodent disease that infects humans via fleas. Right now, we don't really have a great story, but we have this fascinating synchronicity between climate event and biological event. So I think it's a great example of where we've learned a lot. There's still a lot to learn, but it's also a kind of chilling example of the highly unpredictable effects of sudden climate change. And climate, one of the concerning things about 21st century climate change is that we know from the historical record that climate change is not linear and predictable, that human and natural systems are full of very complex threshold and feedback mechanisms. And so the day-to-day rate of change might seem relatively limited, but then that can change instantaneously on human timescales. So the 6th century is, I think, in that way, a very resonant period for us to think about. Since I've talked more about that, I'll kind of cut short the bigger question. I do think climate matters in Roman history. I think there's still a lot to be learned. But even in ancient societies, temperature changes over decadal timescales of 1 degree have major human repercussions. And I think we can actually use that in a way to help think about and even maybe communicate the importance of contemporary climate change, because it's really from the perspective of somebody who's thought about climate changes on human timescales in the ancient past. The magnitude of what's not just possible but likely over the next century is very disturbing and alarming, and I think a warrant for respecting nature and changing mindsets, as Rupa put it. So that's a quick answer to those. I don't know if the COVID-19 was directed at me, but I'd be happy to say what I can about it, but would be happier to hear Rupa's response to that.
Would be good if you took a shot at it, Kyle, and I can follow up.
Okay. I think in some way the COVID-19 crisis is really best understood not as driven by climate change per se, but rather driven by the same massive and rapid ecological transformations that are driven by human demographic increase and the consequent resource utilization that imposes on natural ecosystems. So what historians like John McNeill have called the Great Acceleration, that has seen a quadrupling of human population over the last 80 to 100 years, as well as extractive technologies that enable humans to alter landscapes with a suddenness that is really shocking, or what are driving climate change, but also what drives the emergence of infectious diseases. And from my perspective, as somebody who's written about diseases, and my next book is a deep and global history of infectious disease that ends with COVID-19. The modern world sees humans gain unprecedented control over infectious disease, with the ability to prevent, mitigate, and treat infectious diseases in a way that has no analog in the ancient world. But at the same time, nature doesn't stand still, and microbes evolve, Darwinian responses to human environmental change. And the COVID-19 pandemic really stands in an unbroken line of threats, some of which have missed, some of which have been near misses, some of which have really already impacted human health and human societies. So the obvious instance is HIV and the AIDS crisis, which is also an evolutionary response that then impacts human societies on a global scale. So COVID-19 is not anomalous in that sense. It's really a direct effect of human population growth, interconnection in a world that is where jet travel connects us all, and makes nowhere on Earth remote, and an expansion of human populations into natural ecosystems where the interface between animal pathogens and human societies is continuously enlarged. So I don't think this is an example where climate change per se drives the emergence of a disease, although that's possible in the future, because climate change will affect vector territory and abundance. It will affect biodiversity and various ecological buffers between human populations and potentially novel infectious diseases. And then climate change will affect human resilience, human health, and human social capacity to control and respond to the threat of infectious diseases. But that's a quick answer to a big, complicated question.
Would you like to add to that?
No, I think that was a very comprehensive response. And I think the lesson we should take from this pandemic is that while the reasons cannot be attributed directly to climate change, more to environmental degradation and proximity between human beings and wild species, it's important of what can happen. It's important of things like this that can be more frequent, specific, tipping points being reached, and the greater likelihood and a tremendous scale of impact in an interconnected world for the future. So.
You also mentioned in your opening statement the problem of the intersection of various different stresses, climate change and other kinds of stresses. And you also mentioned the difficulty to assess causality. Where does the causality goes? Migration, war, other forms of conflict, and it's interesting to see. It's the same that Kyle also mentioned for the historical period. I think that's fascinating. But maybe we can go to the next question.
There are actually still many questions, and one is very specific and is regarding rather Rupa, I think, looking at the positive sides, if possible, of climate change. What about absorbing of seawater and using it for agriculture, so-called recycling of seawater where water level is raised? What about looking at positive aspects of climate change, developing of solar energy and using it, and working on finding solutions to avoid bad consequences?
Absolutely. I think that's a great question. And as I said, climate change can trigger a tremendous amount of technological leapfrogging. It can, transform major sectors of society. For example, transportation. In developing countries, we don't have to go through the whole transition from public transport to very private, diesel-powered private transportation, and then back again to public transport, but you can leapfrog directly. Similarly, solar technology has really become affordable. It's been an area of tremendous innovation and development in recent times, and I think it has really transformed the energy system in developing countries. I travel a lot to West Africa, for example, and families do not have an electricity bulb, but they have a solar-powered mobile charging station. And once that comes into the household, other things also start to happen, So absolutely, fully agree that technology provides us many opportunities for leapfrogging. With regard to agriculture, it is more complex. We have been working on saline-tolerant rice, for example, in many geographies over several decades now. It's complex. Many of them need to be locally adapted. There are other feedback loops that start. One of the important transitions we saw is that when soil salinity ingress happens, the first adaptation is that people go for shrimp farming. But that quickly becomes a maladaptive approach because it's quite intensive in inputs, and then if the water is not circulated enough, you have the disease and greater amounts of pesticides, etc., have to be put in, and then it brings the salinity further inland, contaminating the freshwater reserves. So one needs to approach it with caution, experiment, learn where things need backtrack if it's got negative consequences, and of course always see the trade-offs with development. So too rapid a change in a system also has adverse impacts on the most vulnerable parts of society. So for example, if you transform a rice-based cultivation system, which provides a lot of employment to women, and mechanize it in different ways, the pace of change has to also match the pace of societal change. So alternate opportunities for women, or relationships in the family where the lack of this employment opportunity doesn't become a source of disempowerment for the most vulnerable segments. So there are many opportunities, but they need to be balanced with the pace of larger societal change. And the risks are, there are certain unknown risks, unanticipated, with each of these technological steps, which also need to be assessed and valued.
Another very interesting question, because it brings, so to say, the approach of the historian into dialogue with the approach from a scientific and political point of view. It starts with the statement by Kyle that historians are the unintended beneficiaries of the new technologies, especially in the natural life sciences, which is certainly true. Now, thinking the other way around, do you think that historical studies investigating, say, interdependence interdependencies between society, environment, and human health issues in antiquity will gain more importance and hence be more and more taken into consideration in studies and reports on future global developments of that kind, like e.g. the IPCC report. Thank you for your contribution.
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the key areas of a vast body of knowledge actually hardly explored in the IPCC report is indigenous and traditional knowledge. And there are vast repositories. I mean, if you see the way the Mayans migrated various plant varieties to higher altitudes, they had a whole system of experimenting with varieties and gradually acclimatizing them to higher altitudes. These are all living traditions, and communities that are living in these areas are aware of them. These are often not documented. They're handed down through oral traditions. We also learn a lot with regard to disasters and predictions, particularly seasonal ones, from indigenous and traditional knowledge. And as a practitioner organization, Helvetas does combine this with scientific know-how that comes from, weather models, etc. So certainly it's a huge area of knowledge that is not fully explored.
I don't know whether Kyle would add to that as well, but anyway, the next question is directed to you. How much impact do you think climate change and plagues had on social structure and cohesion? I'm thinking about preferring barbarian dress modes in response to colder weather, deprivileging traditional dress with its social markers, Hellenization of medicine, invitation of the cult of Asclepius into Rome, etc.
Well, where do I start? That's a big question, and I think that it's very hard to know what were the effects of some of these environmental challenges on societies, particularly to the north of the Roman Empire, and sometimes across other frontiers, just because the historical records are so discrepant, and the richness of the historical records are so imbalanced. And so I do sometimes get asked, well, didn't some of these things affect the barbarians? And I'm certain that they would have to a certain extent, but without the same density of human documentation that at least sometimes provides us with ways to understand the human impacts. It can be very hard to assess even crudely how some of these societies were affected. But that too can change with archaeology and with new evidence. Just to cite one example of this at work, where I think we've learned a lot that we didn't know before because we didn't have written records, which concerns the archaeological DNA evidence for the spatial reach of the plague of Justinian. So I mentioned in the middle of the 6th century, there's an outbreak, a major pandemic of the particular disease and plague caused by Yersinia pestis. We have very vivid, colorful reports of what this was like in places like Constantinople, which was the Roman capital, where most of our texts were written. And so inevitably, we're very richly informed about what the experience of this plague was like there. And we have two fairly lengthy contemporary eyewitness accounts, and they are very consistent, even though they're independent and written by people with very different worldviews. And we know a lot about how they were trying to deal with the disposal of the bodies and some of the extreme measures they took. Then if you go through the Latin half of the old Roman Empire, through Western Europe, we have 4 or 5 written sources for this whole territory. And we have about as many sources, we have fewer sources for all of Western Europe for this first outbreak than we have for one city in Constantinople. So how do historians grapple with that? It's one area where the archaeological tools informed by natural sciences are starting to cast some light in this very shadowy area. And so, for instance, the recovery of ancient biomolecules, the actual DNA of the bacterium, the pathogen that killed people in the plague, that can sometimes, when conditions are aligned, be recovered from the teeth that preserve enough of the blood encased in the enamel to recover the DNA of the germ that killed people. When all of that happens, you can sometimes get the DNA of the pathogen out. And this is starting to take us where there aren't written sources. And so most of the plague DNA recovered so far comes from Bavaria in the 6th and 7th centuries. We didn't have written evidence for the plague getting there. We don't honestly think that this was a hotbed of plague. The reason that a lot of plague has been found in Bavaria is because there's a lot of science and modern, well-funded German archaeologists in Bavaria, and they're looking for it. And it's a fascinating indication that the plague got to places where we don't have written evidence. So, in other words, some of these questions that are very hard about did the plague affect people beyond Rome are potentially going to be answerable. They're very hard to answer today. That's starting to change. And so we can hypothesize. I think it's important that we ask those questions because very likely some of these diseases would have made it past the Roman Empire, but in other ways, the Roman Empire would have been worse impacted because it was more interconnected, more urbanized, more travel, more trade, more communication, and thus more vulnerable. So we can ecologically reason about what some of the differences may have been, and then increasingly we have some evidence, but it's still a very hard question.
I think the last point you mentioned is very interesting. You write in your book about the Romans who are rich but sick, that in some way they created through their own success, their urbanization, the development of the Mediterranean world into a very dense network of communities. They created the conditions for this catastrophe of the end of antiquity, that could happen, and that reminds us in many ways in what happens today. I think we have more questions.
We have questions that regard in particular this phenomenon of migration and traveling. There is one observation rather that the spectacular sea travel safety in the late Roman Republic times allowed for massive migration within the empire, e.g. for Jews making 7% of the population, 1/3 of Alexandria, and the rapid spread of the Christian religion. Another question refers to this famous topic of the migrations, which we dealt with in our first lecture series of the Center for the Study of the Ancient World here in Zurich. And there the question which is brought up in this context is how much of those migrations were due to climate change or to other catastrophes. And a third question, which then also makes the bridge to the contemporary situation, talking about the combustion engine, which made people able to move over very long distances in very short time. What has the experience in ancient times on how societies cope with an overwhelming influx of people in a very short time? Is research being done on how many people are expected to become climate refugees during this century? Shall the climate targets not be met? Therefore, I mean, it's more a question for the Roman world, but then also for the contemporary. Shall we start with the contemporary and then go back to the Roman world?
Sure, thanks. So the countries that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, among them are the small island nations. They are the ones facing existential crisis, and they are deeply opposed to being called climate refugees. They believe that it's their right to be relocated to safer areas, and these need to be recognized. They are not refugees that need to be provided refuge under the 1952 law. There is also the concern that there is also the fact that most of the displacements that are happening because of disasters are actually displacing people within their national boundaries. So they're not really migrating across national boundaries. The larger amount, and the figures are estimated at multiple levels, the biggest extent of migration is really within countries and followed by regional. And this topic tends to get politicized and also gets quite a lot of radical interest. So we believe that the right terminology is disaster and displacement rather than climate migration. And the biggest extent of this is actually within countries. Now, Bangladesh is one country facing a significant scale of migration, given also the population density in the country. And the country is preparing a series of secondary cities to absorb the influx of people that they expect will happen from the coastal areas. So this kind of national level preparedness is also starting. And I think the claims of people to protection are at different levels and need to be analyzed as such.
And the questions regarding antiquity.
It's a fascinating topic, and I was very intrigued by what Rupa was just saying, because I think we, as ancient historians, could probably do more to think about the relationship between climate crisis and internal migration than it's a topic that's important and probably hasn't received the attention it deserves. There's obviously the parallel issue of longer distance migration and climate drivers, and Roman historians and late antique historians endlessly debate the topic of migration, because this is a period of the supposed movement or migration of peoples, and that'll be a topic that keeps us employed debating for at least 2100, at least until the end of this century. But the reason is because the issues are so important and so big and complex. And I'll just say here that I think this is an area too where I'd be very optimistic that the next 5 to 10 years could see important and genuinely new evidence brought into the debate. I don't think that the scientific DNA evidence is by itself going to resolve all of these longstanding controversies about the importance of invasion and movement of peoples in late antiquity. But I think if used right and collaboratively between disciplines, this is an area where we're already starting to see, for instance, there's been a major study on the DNA of a Lombard cemetery in northern Italy that clearly shows that, of course, this was thought to be a migrant population. Was in fact does show genetic signatures of coming from outside of Italy. You saw there was last year a major paper published in Science about the genetics of Italy over the long term that showed really fascinating patterns, even for early Roman Empire. So this isn't the movement of peoples in late antiquity, but the area around Rome in the first century AD is characterized by significant changes in the genetics of the local population, reflecting movement from the East Mediterranean to a certain extent from North Africa. So it's I think a small promise of what's possible in future studies as we get a better picture of when and how far and ultimately why people moved in and around the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, I've no doubt, was a powerful force for moving people from from involuntary movement via the slave trade and conquest to voluntary movement that's stimulated by push or pull factors. So it's an area where we're going to learn a lot, and I think it will be important to keep in mind the environment as one dimension of what drives human movement. And I like the idea of thinking about both internal, but also some of these bigger external migrations as being at least in part stimulated by climate changes.
I think we have one last question.
I mean, there would be more questions, but with big topics and questions like causes of climate change and rational, irrational explanatory. But I think one question is probably really ideal towards the end, because it's always the question, what can one learn from history in a way as well? And at the same time, what will be the impact of what's going on for our current political system? I read this question, which is directed to both experts in particular. Which influence efficient future global regulations to adapt to climate change will have on our existing different systems of democracy? And with respect to pre-modern societies, can we learn anything from their reactions to reform their political systems?
You want me to go first? I'll jump in and say it's a question, particularly as somebody who's worked on infectious disease in human history, that I've been confronted with a lot over the last 15, 16 months. And it's a very hard question. What lessons can we draw from history? And I do think that there's very little policy insight to be gained from looking at ancient responses to pandemic disease or to climate crisis. It's not to say it's not worth trying, and there aren't insights that we can gain from some of their responses, but the technology and the understanding of the mechanisms that both cause and potentially resolve the challenges we face is so vastly different today. But I still think that it's important to have historical perspective, because it makes the science stronger, to have deeper timescales. If we're looking at changes over the last 30 years, we're going to have more robust data, but there are also going to be limits because the timescale is shorter and the sort of boundaries of experience are narrower, and there are trade-offs. The evidence gets harder to use, but the timescale and scope of change becomes clearer in some ways with a longer timescale. So I think it's important for climate scientists, for people who study human responses, for people who study the emergence of diseases, to remember that it's important to take a longer perspective and to see that the last 60, 70 years of the human experience are highly exceptional, and the pressures that we put on the Earth system are truly extraordinary. And so I think there's value in encompassing a perspective that's deeper in time, and I think it'll make the science better. But I think it also ultimately has a humanistic purpose, and I think this is where the sciences and the humanities can also strengthen each other, is by changing the stories we tell, the way we understand our own past. If environmental change and environmental challenge has always been one of the really determining forces of human societies, I think it would be arrogant to believe that we're, even as powerful as our technologies and science are exempt from that really fundamental pattern. And by telling the human story in a way that incorporates disease and climate change, it reframes our mindset in a way that helps us understand that these are really going to be fundamental drivers of the success of our species over the next century. And it becomes less surprising and easier to, I think, confront that if we realize that's the story of who we are and where we've been collectively. So that's my answer.
I've been involved in studying the impact of COVID-19 in 25 developing countries, really focusing on the poorest communities within these. So we've had a sample survey of about 16,000 people across these countries, and what it brings out very clearly and strongly is that the underlying drivers of vulnerability are the ones that just expose populations to huge amount of risk in this situation. For example, the structure of the economy, the greater the informality of the national economy, more dramatic have been the impacts on households of the lockdowns, but also of the pandemic itself. Access to technology for children out of school, the nature of governance, how decentralized, accountable. This has exploded across the whole world. So where there have been weaknesses in systems, they've been starkly visible to all of us. And we are right now in the middle of the pandemic, so we will have many lessons to learn. But I think these will be vitally important lessons that should transform systems in the years ahead. And I think the ability to learn from these experiences will be the metric of the degree of success of different societies. So it's a dramatic period that we are living through, and I think the lessons we draw would be outstanding if we do learn our lessons from this. Thanks a lot.
Well, these were two wonderful closing statements to our discussion today. Rupa mentioned in her opening statement that one of the challenges in communicating climate change really is this gap between the human scale time horizons and this large time horizons that we see when we look at climate change. I think looking at history can help us bridge that gap, at least to some degree. We as historians, if we can do anything, then it's put time scales into smaller scales, and really took this view over longer periods. And I think this is one place where we as historians, as humanists, as scientists working in the humanities, have to bring ourselves into the discussions, while we learn so much from what you do, what scientists do in our contemporary world and present periods. And I think this discussion today has shown from these very different perspectives how many intersections we really have in our discussions. And I thank you, Rupa, and you, Kyle, very much for this very stimulating discussion. I also thank all of you for your inputs, your questions. I'm sure there would be any more questions. I would have more questions, but we will have to discuss them another time. Ich möchte die Ringvorlesung nicht ohne ein Wort des Dankes abschließen. Es ist die letzte Sitzung heute. Es wäre nicht möglich gewesen, diese Ringvorlesung durchzuführen, wenn wir nicht die Unterstützung von ganz vielen Leuten gehabt hätten, gerade unter diesen schwierigen technischen Bedingungen, unter denen wir arbeiten. Das fängt an beim Hörsaaldienst, der uns immer wieder zu Hilfe geeilt ist. Ich möchte selbstverständlich aber auch allen Kolleginnen und Kollegen danken, die als Referentinnen in diesem Semester uns ihre Einsichten zur Thematik präsentiert haben. Klaus Jonas haben Sie heute noch mal gehört. Er hat uns in seiner gesamten Amtszeit als Dekan, die auch jetzt zu Ende geht, ganz intensiv unterstützt und auch mit großem Interesse begleitet. Viele Leute haben im Hintergrund mitgewirkt bei der Organisation und Durchführung. Bohdan Stehlik hat sich um die Videoaufnahmen gekümmert und hat diese aufbereitet. Barbara Holler hat als Geschäftsführerin des ZAZH immer wieder dafür gesorgt, dass wir einen Platz haben, dass alles funktioniert und dass alles rechtzeitig am richtigen Ort ist. Die Schweizer Winnicke Stiftung hat uns finanziell unterstützt. Ohne diese finanzielle Unterstützung wäre es uns gar nicht möglich gewesen, diese Ringvorlesung in dieser Art und Weise durchzuführen. An letzter Stelle möchte ich ganz besonders Ihnen danken, die uns wöchentlich am Bildschirm gefolgt sind. Gerade jetzt, wenn man immer wieder in einen leeren Hörsaal spricht, wird es einem erst richtig bewusst, dass all das, was wir hier tun, eigentlich nur Sinn hat, wenn auch jemand zuhört, wenn jemand Interesse an den Sachen hat, wenn wir eben auch die Resonanz von Ihnen bekommen. All jenen unter Ihnen, die noch im Rahmen einer Vorlesungsprüfung in einer Woche unter Beweis stellen dürfen, dass Sie ganz viel gelernt haben in dieser Veranstaltung, wünsche ich dafür sehr viel Erfolg. Bereiten Sie sich gewissenhaft vor, aber machen Sie sich keine Sorgen. Ihnen allen wünsche ich auch im Namen von Christoph Riedweg einen erholsamen, möglichst katastrophen- und krisenfreien Sommer, und ich freue mich jetzt schon darauf, Sie auch im Herbstsemester wieder bei der einen oder anderen Veranstaltung begrüßen zu dürfen. And now with one more thank you to Rupa and Kyle, I can close this event today. Thank you very much.